Hey everyone, welcome to today's Monday Morning Minute. Today is Monday, October 12th, and here's what we have going on today. So first of all, I'd love to touch base briefly about the feedback form that you all filled out last week. Thank you so much for your feedback. And then I'll touch on this week's readings. We're thinking about identifying learning goals, interpreting data, scaffolding, etc. We're all in this new unit around designing ethical assessments. And then finally, we will just talk really briefly about the teacher interview project that's coming up, due in quotation marks, this Sunday, the 18th. Okay, so thank you all so much for your candid feedback. That was so helpful. I hope this is also maybe just a plug for you all to do this with your own students as well, to solicit that feedback, to really get a sense of how they're doing. So some major themes I wanted to share with you. First off, it seems like this course is relatively well organized, which I'm so happy to hear, and that folks feel like they know what's due when and how to find all of the information they need to be successful. So I'll certainly try to keep that up. Some of us mentioned that we like these high quality, super high production value videos, these Monday morning minutes. So I'll continue to create these throughout the semester as well. And then in terms of things that are not working, several of us mentioned that we actually would want more synchronous sessions, just because it's really cool to be able to spend time together synchronously. There's something awesome that happens when we all come together. So I totally get that. And the bottom left here is a breakdown of the response in which I asked you all to weigh in on how much you think, or sort of the balance between the asynchronous and synchronous learning that we do. And so half of you feel as though that ratio is fine, and half of you feel as though we actually need more synchronous sessions. So considering all of that, here are some changes that I'm making to the course structure that I hope will appease everyone more or less. So first of all, I'm going to make the remaining critical response forums, those little discussion groups, we're actually all going to be in one whole group. So when you log into Blackboard next and you're in our course and you click on that critical response group link at the left, you'll notice everyone's in critical response group number 1. And I've done this for a couple of reasons. First off, I think it's about the halfway point in the semester. I think it'll be helpful and, dare I say, exciting to interact with people that weren't in your small group for the first half of the semester. So I encourage you, for the remaining forums that we have, to seek out new voices. And I think that'll be just really awesome for us as a cohort. I know you all are really tight, and so I'm hoping that this allows you to get a sense of what other peers of yours are thinking. And then the second reason is because for at least one of those remaining critical response weeks, we're actually going to have an optional synchronous session. And the key word here is optional. There is zero repercussion if you can't attend or don't want to attend, and no RSVP is needed at all. Just either show up or don't, and either way is fine. But we'll try this out. So I'd like to schedule us an optional synchronous session for October 20th, so about 2 weeks from our last synchronous session. And I imagine that this will be about 45 minutes to an hour long, so not as long as we normally go when we meet synchronously. And the focus will be exclusively on discussion and discussing that week's readings. And that'll be, like as I said, our main focus. And to sweeten the pot a little bit, since that week we do have critical response number 4 due, if you are able to come to that synchronous session and you're able to participate with us in this discussion, that will count as your completion of critical response number 4. You do not have to then additionally write your initial posts and follow-up posts, etc. So your attendance, once again, at that optional session means you don't have to do critical response number 4. Your participation in the synchronous session counts as that. Let me know if anything about that was confusing. But again, I'm kind of looking at a couple other dates in the future of maybe doing something like this again. All right, so as I mentioned, we're in the last module/unit of our course, thinking about how can we design and implement ethical assessments? And this is a huge question. And it's one I think that will, in some ways, necessarily depend upon our content areas. And this course, as I think I've shared, is an interesting one in that a lot of assessment techniques and norms and conventions are very discipline specific. And so I want you all, of course, to learn those norms and conventions, which will happen, certainly through this field experience, certainly through student teaching, and you probably already have a good sense of it just from being a student. So, understand those norms and conventions. But I also want you all to push against them when necessary and to feel like you have the confidence to do that and that you have the skill, like you have a clear direction of where you'll go if you're going to diverge from those norms and conventions. So there's just a little background or how I'm thinking about this particular unit for us. And so to start things off, this week this is kind of, I guess, maybe the last week where we're looking at sort of norms and conventions. And then kind of thinking about how to design culturally responsive assessments. And this is tricky. There are a lot of folks out there who believe that culturally responsive assessment entails, standardized assessments. This is kind of where we started this semester, thinking about the education debt. And there are, huge proponents of standardized assessments out there who say, how on earth can we know where people are, where our students are, if we're not standardizing our assessments? But of course, this creates other issues, certainly ones around equity. So anyway, that's a really big windup, only to say that this week we're looking at, to get some basic understandings around terms like backward design, terms like formative assessment, scaffolding, and interpreting formative assessment. And I'm using a lot of air quotes throughout here. Okay, so on the left-hand side of the screen right now, this is our first reading this week. It's from Wiggins and McTighe. It's from their book called Understanding by Design, which maybe you've heard of. And this is just the first chapter of that book. It's called What is Backward Design? This is a classic piece in teacher education literature. Backward design is certainly widely accepted among public schools. Many public schools will, accept it, but don't actually do it. And then there are those, myself somewhat among them, who think that we need to go way beyond backward design. All of this is just to say that I want you all to understand what backward design is, because it certainly implicates the way that we think about assessment. So the basic gist is that we are starting with the end in mind. So rather than just kind of, making a lesson plan for tomorrow and then, figure out how it went and then make another lesson plan for the next day and then figure, maybe a couple weeks later, you're like, well, I guess we should have a test now. I guess I'll write that test, which seems kind of aimless, without like a clear goal in mind. Wiggins and McTighe are all about starting with that big goal in mind. So thinking about the big ideas you want to convey over the course of a unit or even over the course of an entire year, and thinking about the skills that students will need in order to achieve that ideal. That's the first step. Then you move to the second step where you figure out, okay, what kind of assessment do I need to create that will let me know that students have achieved those skills, that they've mastered these skills? And then only then do you start figuring out sort of the daily pieces and scaffolding the skills necessary such that students, when they get to that assessment task, can pass it, right? Can demonstrate their knowledge successfully. Again, this is a little different than I think maybe we might imagine planning to be. And I also don't want to repeat anything that maybe you've already heard about or thought about to death. But this is my hope that we can just kind of get on the same page thinking about backward design. Now, this is popular for a lot of reasons that are equity-based. It has also been critiqued for reasons that are equity-based. For instance, sort of the low-hanging fruit here when we think about this progression is that there's very little space for students, right? This isn't a particularly student-friendly model. the teacher at every step is determining exactly what's going to happen and what happens when, students want to deviate, or, there's just really no space for their voice. So that's, a major critique here. But I still think it's really helpful. I think it's a good practice to really figure out what the end goal is and then plan everything towards that. In addition to this chapter, I've put together another little handout for you all, just to make sure that we are on the same page when it comes to terms like formative assessment and scaffolding. Again, I'm sure you've heard these terms before, perhaps you know them in and out. This is just a way for me to ensure that we're somewhat on the same page. And a lot of educational research tells us that while we have, there's a lot of focus on summative assessments, so those big kind of maybe end of unit, end of semester, end of year tests, it's actually formative assessment that's so much more flexible, so much more pliable, and is frankly much more likely to be within your control as a teacher, rather than those summative assessments, which might be uniform across, your grade level or your school or your district or the state. So there is just a renewed focus on formative assessment and using it thoughtfully and effectively. So when we're thinking about formative assessment, we're thinking about several things. First of all, do these formative assessments align with content standards? Do they align with what you've actually taught? Which is, just to take another little tangent here, a little bird walk, which is kind of my issue with Teachers Pay Teachers, which is an online website you've probably heard of. And man, I think it's such a fabulous idea because, of course, teachers are notoriously underpaid. And here's a website where you can compensate a fellow teacher for their labor, for their work. And that's, I think, really fantastic. What is not so fantastic, though, is that, these are all materials that are aligned towards what that teacher has been teaching, right? Their take on metaphors and similes, perhaps, or their take on the Civil War. And that may not necessarily be what your take is. So that's just kind of my caveat with Teachers Pay Teachers. Make sure that your assessments align with what you have been teaching students. Formative assessments should also provide enough detail so that you, the teacher, when you're analyzing the data, let you know what was understood about the lesson, what wasn't understood, and why things weren't understood. That's the mark of a good formative assessment. Of course, we've talked about the importance of timely feedback, and then crucially, formative assessment is characterized by both teachers and students taking some substantive action based on those assessments. So this is just like a little preview of that handout. Feel free to skim it, especially if it's information that you've already encountered. Okay, and then do this week, and do should also be kind of in scare quotes. Which words shouldn't be? I don't know, this week. We just have that teacher interview project coming up. Remember that the deadlines, particularly, like all deadlines are soft at this point, especially the major projects. So get it in if you can by Sunday the 18th, but if that is going to cause undue stress and be, an unnecessary burden at this time in your life, do not worry about it. 100% don't worry. All right. Thank you all so much for watching this wacky little video. And I hope to see as many of you as possible in a couple of weeks, but please know that I'm here anytime in between now and then. And just a gentle reminder, I do have office hours every Tuesday from 1 to 3 p.m. and I'm also available by appointment. So if anything comes up, if you have any questions, let me know. All right, everyone. Cheers.